July 1935. A Boeing prototype, the Model 299, lifts off the runway with great difficulty, and one random journalist, looking at this behemoth, utters a phrase that would outlive both the aircraft itself and the entire war. 15 bombs, 5 machine guns, 3 engines. It's a flying fortress. He said it almost as a joke, but the nickname stuck. Flying Fortress, and that's that. From that moment on, the plane didn't just have a name. It had a reputation it still had to earn. And believe me, it proved itself. With every combat sortie, every bullet hole, every return home. But it wasn't just firepower that brought this machine its fame. What mattered most was something else, an almost mythical, almost impossible survivability. Just think about it. These bombers returned to their bases with their tails torn off, their fuselages shot right through, and only 2 of their 4 engines working. Not on paper, not in legends, in the real skies over Germany. How is that even possible? Was it luck? A miracle? An enemy mistake? Or was there a cold, ruthless calculation behind it, which we'll discuss further? This goes to the very heart of the whole story. The fortress had no right to fall, and it almost always returned. Forget the pretty fairy tale about luck. It is adored by people who understand absolutely nothing about a war of engines. A machine that was dragged home again and again on a wing and a prayer, on its very last breath, is no darling of fortune. Luck does not explain this. Luck runs out on the second mission, and the fortresses came back by the dozen, by the 100. So where is the secret? Honestly, there is no secret at all. There is a cold, calculating answer, and it is far more frightening than any beautiful legend. The survivability of the fortress was no gift from the heavens and no whim of fate. It was the sum of 3 things stacked up by the merciless hands of engineers, generals, and industrialists. 3 pillars, and not one of them left to chance. Pillar 1. The design. From the very first blueprint, this machine was not built for elegance or for speed records. It was built to come back. Punched through, mangled, smoking, but back on its own airfield. This applies to the very foundation of the whole story. The fortress was conceived as a machine almost impossible to finish off, and there was not a gram of luck in that idea, only cold engineering arithmetic. Pillar 2. The tactics. A single aircraft in the skies over the Reich was doomed, and both sides understood that perfectly well. But dozens of machines, packed into one tight formation bristling with barrels, turned into something that breaking through meant suicide. Alone, an easy target. Together, a solid wall of fire that German fighters entered already saying their goodbyes. Pillar 3. The industry. And here is where the most cynical part of the whole picture begins. While crews clung to their machines in the freezing sky, far across the ocean, beyond the reach of any bomb, a conveyor was running that did not care at all. New fortresses rolled off the line faster than the enemy could knock the old ones down. This applies to the very heart of the American strategy in that war, to win not through the heroics of lone men, but through an overwhelming, cold, unstoppable superiority of numbers. There is the whole trick for you. No miracle, no guardian angels, no special luck, no mysticism above the clouds. Only metal, formation, and the factory flood, multiplied together and thrown onto the scales. And each of these 3 pillars we are about to crack open one by one, with no gloss, no discounts, and no allowance for a pretty legend. Now, to the hardware. To that very calculation that turned a heap of aluminum into a machine that refused to fall. 5 decisions. 5 reasons the fortress spat in the face of German flak again and again and came back to the field it had taken off from. Not lucky. There was simply nothing left to finish it off with. Decision 1. The semi-monocoque fuselage. It sounds like a term from a textbook, but behind it stands a hard engineering truth. A rigid frame of aluminum alloy beneath a smooth, load-bearing skin. A body like that did not hold all the strain in a single point. It spread it across the entire structure. Punch it in 10 places and it would still carry the crew home. This applies to the central principle of the whole machine. No single hit should ever decide the fate of the aircraft. Decision 2. A tail section with a monstrous margin of strength. The designers built in a toughness that looked excessive, almost wasteful, and it was exactly that excess that saved crews time after time. A tail with chunks ripped out of it, a tail turned into a sieve, kept the machine in the air where any other bomber would have folded in half long before. Decision 3. 4 independent engines. These were Wright Cyclone motors, the R1820 model, and they ran separately with no dependence on one another. One quits, the machine flies on 3. 2 fall silent. The fortress still pulls, still holds formation, still crawls toward its own lines. And to drive that independence home, the designers backed up the control systems too. A single failed line did not leave the pilots holding dead controls. This applies to the very philosophy of this machine. The fortress always kept an escape route in reserve. Decision 4. Defense with not a single blind spot. Here is where the German aces truly turned sick. In its later versions, the Fortress carried 13 heavy Browning M2 guns of 50 caliber, and they swept the entire space around the machine. Above, below, the sides, the tail. Gunners of neighboring aircraft covered one another with crossfire. 2 positions were especially vicious: the upper Bendix ball turret and the tail gun mount. There was simply nowhere for an attacker to slip in without catching a burst. To close in on a machine like that was to fly straight under several barrels at once. Decision 5. Self-sealing fuel tanks. From the B-17G version on, the tanks received a self-sealing rubber coating that closed a puncture almost instantly. And it was fire, nothing else, that was the main reason machines did not come back to base. A hold tank no longer turned the bomber into a torch, it simply sealed shut, like a wound under a bandage. This applies to the cold conclusion of all that design work. The Fortress was stripped of its weakest spot right there at the factory, long before its first mission. Stack these 5 decisions together, and what you get is not an aircraft, but a stubborn, heavy, almost unkillable machine. No beauty, no record breaker. A workhorse honed for one single thing: to come back no matter the cost. December the 20th, 1943. Somewhere over the freezing North Sea crawls what only that morning had been a working bomber. A machine named Ye Olde Pub of the 379th Bomb Group is coming back from a strike on Bremen, and it is coming back in a state that turns the stomach at a single glance. To grasp what happened next, you have to picture what this machine had just clawed its way out of. Bremen met the Americans with a dense wall of anti-aircraft fire and a swarm of fighters. The sky there boiled with metal. And Ye Olde Pub tore itself free of that inferno, but paid a terrible price for it. It was no longer flying. It was fading in the air, slowly and stubbornly. The tail is all but sheared away. 3 engines out of 4 are out of action. The fuselage is one long row of ragged holes with an icy wind howling through them. Most of the crew is out of the fight, many badly broken, some barely able to hold on. The machine hardly answers the controls, dragging itself on the last of its strength, bleeding altitude, and to anyone watching from the side, one thing is clear: it will never make it. And at that moment, he appears alongside a German fighter, a Messerschmitt Bf-109. At the stick, First Lieutenant Franz Stiegler, a seasoned ace for whom finishing off a target like this is the work of a few seconds. A defenseless, almost motionless target packed with wounded men. One pass, one short burst, and nothing of the fortress would be left. By every law of war, he was bound to press the trigger. This applies to the terrible choice that war throws at a man in a fraction of a second. In front of Stiegler is not a formation of fortresses bristling with barrels, not an equal opponent, but a mangled machine that can no longer answer with a single shot. And he hesitates. His finger will not settle on the trigger. What the German pilot saw at point-blank range turned the whole logic of combat upside down. He pulled in close and made out the wounded men inside, men who could no longer resist. He understood that before him was not an enemy in a fight, but a doomed crew hauling its machine home on the last of its strength. And the ace made a decision that, back in the Reich, would have put him against a wall without a second word. He would not finish off the defenseless. One report and a tribunal. He knew it, and he lowered his weapon all the same. Instead of opening fire, Stiegler tucked in beside them. He flew his fighter wing to wing with the broken fortress and escorted it. He led it through the zones where German anti-aircraft guns could have torn it apart at close range, shielding it with his own aircraft and signaling to his own crews on the ground with a gesture. "This one is mine. Leave it." He saluted the courage of a foreign enemy crew and let it go toward the coastline, toward safety, toward its own people. This applies to one of the most astonishing pages of that entire war, a moment when, through the hatred, the orders, and the iron logic of the front, something broke through that has no place in any regulation. An enemy let an enemy go. The hunter lowered his weapon before prey he could have taken with his bare hands. And he did it not out of weakness, but out of something that turned out to be stronger than the war itself. The fortress made it. Torn apart, on its very last breath, it still crossed the sea and managed to put itself down on the ground. The crew came through. The same men who that morning had said goodbye to any hope of seeing the earth again. And the story of how a German ace escorted a doomed American machine all the way home, instead of finishing it off, became a legend. One of those that get retold decades later by people who cannot believe it ever happened in the very heart of that war. There is the price of the word fortress for you, and the price of the word man in the middle of the cruelest slaughter of the century. In a sky where everything was bent toward destruction alone, there was one who, for a single second, refused to destroy. And that is exactly why this machine, and this mission, and this name, Ye Olde Pub, are remembered to this day, and will be remembered for a long time yet. But even the most unkillable machine, alone over the Reich, was doomed. And the Americans worked that out fast. So to a brilliant design they added a second pillar, a tactic that rang cold through every German pilot. They bet on massed daylight raids, dozens and hundreds of bombers going in by day, in full light, to hit strategic targets precisely instead of by guesswork. By day, in full light. That means you can see the target, but everyone can see you too. Every flak gunner, every fighter, every observation post. You move through a charted sky like a target on a range, and your only answer is not to hide, but to bunch together and bite back all at once. And it is right here that the central idea is born, the idea that held the fortresses in the sky as firmly as the rivets held their skin. The idea was called the combat box, And behind that dull, clerical phrase hid a merciless arithmetic of survival. The machines did not fly any which way, did not stretch out into a helpless string. They were drawn up rigidly, in steps by altitude, in a checkerboard pattern, packed tight, shoulder to shoulder, so that the guns of one fortress covered the blind spots of the next. This applies to the very core of that formation. Each single bomber defended not only itself, it defended the ones flying beside it, above it, below it. Dozens of machines poured their defensive fire into one hole, into a dense, layered field that swept the sky in every direction at once. The cones of fire from neighboring machines overlapped, leaving no empty, safe corridors in the sky. A fighter that chose to attack flew not under the guns of one aircraft, but under the crossing tracers of a dozen barrels at the same time. Picture that from the ground. Not a group of separate aircraft, but a single organism, bristling with hundreds of gun barrels in every direction. A flying hedgehog. Heavy, slow, clumsy, and almost untouchable as long as it held its shape. To dive into something like that was like throwing yourself chest first onto a hedgehog. You prick yourself on every spine at once. This applies to the brutal law that every crew learned by heart. The strength was in the formation, and only in the formation. Let one machine fall behind, lose speed, drop out of the box, and in an instant it turned from part of a fearsome organism into a lone, defenseless target. The German fighters waited for exactly that. They circled the edges like wolves around a herd, picking off the stragglers, the damaged, the ones who lagged. Break away from your own, and you might as well already be gone. That is why holding the formation at any cost was not a wish, but an iron order, a law whose breaking meant the end. A wounded machine, an aircraft leaking fuel, a damaged engine, none of it gave the right to leave the box. Pilots clung to the formation with the last of their strength because the formation was life, and being alone in that sky was a sentence. But this armor made of formation had its own price, a brutal one. Holding the box meant giving up almost all maneuver. You could not dodge, could not slip sideways, could not drop altitude sharply. Any such jerk broke the formation and exposed your neighbors. There was no room here for lone daring or for life-saving turns, only the cold, hammered discipline of the formation. And so crews flew in a straight line for hours, straight through the wall of flak, watching the machines beside them flare up and fall away, and still they did not turn. This applies to a kind of nerve that is hard even to imagine today. To hold a straight course under fire hour after hour, knowing that one frightened lurch to the side would finish not only you. And so design and tactics locked into a single whole. A strong machine gave a chance to survive under fire. A tight formation turned that chance into a system. Separately, a heap of aircraft. Together, one heavy, deadly fist that slowly but surely battered its way through the sky over Germany. A group of 20, 30 fortresses stopped being merely a group. It became a fortress squared, a wall moving through the air and refusing to give way to anything. And now, a straight question to you, and the answer is nowhere near as obvious as it looks at first glance. What really dragged these machines out of the fire time after time? Their own factory-forged toughness, or the tactic that fused dozens of bombers into a single whole? The design or the formation? Metal or discipline? Let us weigh both sides honestly, because each one has its own iron truth, and neither can simply be waved away. The first side says, it was the steel that decided everything.
A machine with its tail torn off, with silent engines, with a body punched clean through, still dragged itself back to its own lines, and often dragged itself alone, with no formation anywhere near it. Self-sealing tanks smothered the fire. Backed-up systems kept it from falling apart in the air. Take away that toughness, and no combat box on Earth will save a heap of burning aluminum.
This applies to a simple but very stubborn argument. First, the machine has to take the hit, and only then does it make sense to talk about tactics. And this side has a trump card that is hard to beat. That same mangled machine from our story made it home alone, all but abandoned by the formation, on nothing but the stubbornness of metal and engines. No box anywhere near it, and still it's set down. There is your proof in its purest form. Where the tactic no longer worked, it was the design that saved the machine. But the second side's argument is no weaker. What good is the toughest machine in the world if it flies over the Reich alone? It will simply be worked over, hit from the tail, from the belly, from the blind spot, and calmly finished off, no matter how many rivets it carries. Alone in that sky, you are already condemned, however good you are. Only the formation turned a single fortress into part of a deadly organism that no one wanted to enter. Take away the tactic, and the enemy will pick these machines off one by one, like targets on a range. The formation was not a backup, but the very condition of survival. Geometry multiplied by steel. This applies to the most uncomfortable question in this whole story. Which comes first? Can these two things even be separated? Or have they fused for good, so that one simply does not work without the other? A strong machine with no formation is easy prey. A perfect formation of weak machines is a pile of wreckage waiting for the first serious blow. Maybe the whole truth is that the fortress became a legend precisely because it had both at once. And there will be someone who says, forget your metal and your boxes, it was the men who decided everything. The ones who brought a crippled machine to the runway on raw will, who did not break the formation when instinct screamed at them to run. Because a machine without a man is just dead metal. And the most perfect formation falls apart in the first minute of a real fight, without the will of every crew. Well, that is a position too, and it will have to be proven as well, on facts, not on fine words. Maybe even that is not the full picture. Maybe both the design and the tactic are only the consequence of something larger, something we will get to next. But that comes a little later. For now, the floor is yours, so write it in the comments, straight and with no hedging. What, in your view, was the decisive thing? Pick a side. If you are for the design, explain why it was the metal and not the formation. If you are for the tactic, prove that without the box all that toughness would have been worth nothing. And if you think splitting them apart makes no sense, say so, and bring your argument hard and to the point. And do not get away with vague lines like, "It all mattered." Name something concrete, a case, a number, an episode that, in your view, settles the argument. This applies directly to you, to those who understand machines and the logic of war. There is no single right answer out of a textbook here. There is your view, your experience, your version. And the strongest, best argued opinions we will take apart separately. Argue, disagree, prove your point. It is out of debates like these that a real understanding is born of how this machine held on in the sky. One question, two sides, and your word, which just might tip the scales. And now we come to the third pillar, the very one without which the first two would have collapsed. The pillar that decided the outcome not of a single battle, but of the entire war in the air. And it was measured not in the sky over Germany, but somewhere else entirely, on factory floors thousands of kilometers from the front. While the fortresses over the Reich burned, broke apart and dragged themselves home on a single engine, something was happening on the far side of the Atlantic that the Germans could neither understand nor stop.
American factories ran at full strength, calmly, steadily, around the clock. No night raids came down on them. No sirens wailed above them. Their workers did not go down into shelters. The war thundered across the ocean, and here there was simply work. This applies to a factor that is often underrated when people talk about war. You can build a brilliant machine. You can devise a brilliant tactic. But if you cannot stamp out those machines faster than you lose them, you have lost, no matter how well you fight. And the Americans could. This was a war of an entirely new kind. Not a duel of knights in the sky, but a collision of two economies, two giant industrial machines.
And in a war like that, the fortress was not just an aircraft. It was a round fired by the whole of American industry at once. Thousands of identical, interchangeable rounds coming off the line without a pause, only with a living crew inside. And here is the number that puts a heavy full stop on this whole conversation. Over the war years, 12,731 bombers of this type were turned out across all its versions. Let that number sink in. Not 100, not 1,000, nearly 13,000 heavy four-engine machines, whole air armies assembled on a conveyor like automobiles. To grasp what that means, picture the rhythm of those factories. Not careful jeweler's assembly, but an endless belt. One machine, then the next, and another, day after day, month after month. Where a German plant strained to put out dozens, an American one turned out hundreds. This was no longer just industry. It was war moved onto a conveyor, where victory was measured not in a surge or a feat of arms, but in tons of aluminum per hour. Behind that figure hid a logic that was simple and terrifying for the enemy. Any loss, however heavy, stopped being a catastrophe. In place of a machine that did not return from its mission, a new one stood ready by the next day, just off the line. And the day after, another, and so on without end. This applies to the very core of American military power. To wage war so that the enemy simply could not keep up with counting your losses because you replaced them faster than he could inflict them. The machine itself made this possible. The fortress was no temperamental prima donna, but a manufacturable product, well suited to mass assembly. It could be put on a production line, and that line was fed by the giants of American industry. The Boeing plants in Seattle, the Douglas Works, the Lockheed Vega shops. They did not stop by day or by night, turning out fortresses one after another, batch after batch. But the strength of this system was not only in numbers, it was also in the speed with which the machine was improved, right in the middle of the war, without halting production. From the B-17F model to the late Grand Master, the B-17G, the fortress changed before your eyes. It grew new gun turrets, it received heavier armor, more powerful engines were fitted to it. The enemy was still working out how to bring down yesterday's fortress, while tomorrow's was already coming off the line, meaner, tougher, with more teeth. This applies to the key, decisive gap between the two opponents. And here is the harshest contrast in this whole story. On the other side of the front was Germany, and Germany was choking. It was chronically short of everything at once: resources, metal, fuel, and above all, men. Experienced pilots who cannot be turned out on a conveyor, who must be trained long and at great cost, and who were growing fewer and fewer. The Germans were losing their aces, and there was no one to replace them. And the longer the war dragged on, the wider that chasm grew. The American rear was still picking up speed, reaching full power, while the German one, by contrast, was running out of breath. One side was increasing both its stream of machines and its stream of men.
The other was losing both, unable to keep up. This applies to the most hopeless position a warring power can find itself in. You fight ever more fiercely, and the enemy only grows more numerous, with no end in sight. And this is where the real answer lies. The fortress's survivability was born not only in its strong fuselage, and not only in the tight formation. It was born in the shops across the ocean, in the accounting ledgers, in the oil reserves, in the training centers that prepared fresh crews.
This was the survivability, not of a single machine, but of an entire system, economic, industrial, human. And in that lies the cold, unwelcome, but honest truth of that war. It is not always the side with the more elegant machine or the braver soldier that wins. Very often it is the side with the deeper rear, the mightier factories, and the longer conveyor. The fortress became the symbol of exactly that kind of victory. The victory of a system that ground the enemy down not with a single surge, but with a flood. Slowly, methodically, inescapably. But every legend has its other side, and for the legend of the unkillable fortress, that other side is especially cruel. Because behind all the talk of survivability, of coming home on 2 engines, of hero machines, hides something the victory reports did not like to mention. The price. A monstrous, cold price, measurable in numbers. Let us start with the scale of what these machines brought down on Europe. Over the war years, the Americans dropped about 1.5 million tons of bombs on the continent, and exactly half of that monstrous weight was carried by the fortresses. Take that in. Half of everything that fell from the American sky onto German cities and factories was delivered by these 4-engine machines. But for every load dropped, someone paid, and the fortresses paid not in scrap metal, but in themselves. About 4,700 machines of this type stayed out there in a foreign sky and never came back. This applies to the simple and terrible bookkeeping of war. For every ton laid on the target, losses piled up on the other side of the scales, machines and crews that could no longer be brought back. And along with the machines, tens of thousands of men did not return. Not a few, not hundreds, tens of thousands of crewmen for whom that mission was the last. Young men sent into that sky in batches, the way the fortresses themselves were sent to the front. And this is where it becomes hardest of all, because each of them had a quota. To be sent home in one piece, a crew had to fly a set number of combat missions, 25. 25 times to climb into a sky raked with fire, reach the target, drop the load, and come back. And now, the figure that runs cold through the blood. A crew's chances of flying all 25 missions and returning home were less than 25%. Less than 25%, fewer than 1 in 4. This applies to the cold, merciless truth that they preferred not to spell out to the young airmen. Put 4 of you in one machine, and statistically, you would be lucky if 1 of you made it to the end of the tour. The other 3 would not come back from that sky. There is the real cost of a ticket aboard this unkillable fortress. Picture what that meant for a 20-year-old. Every mission a separate toss of a coin, and the coin falling against you. You count it off to yourself, the 5th mission, the 10th, the 15th, and each time you understand that the side of the scale holding your return grows lighter. After every mission, empty bunks were left at the base. Yesterday, the man beside you in the barracks was joking. The next day, a new arrival took his place, and the circle closed again. And here is the most terrible thing in this whole story. It was not chance, not an oversight, not a tragic mistake. It was a calculation, a cold, deliberate, decided in advance calculation. The command knew these numbers perfectly well, and still sent the fortresses into the sky again and again. This applies to the most cynical logic of that war.
Let industry replace the losses faster than the enemy's will can be broken. Steel and aluminum against human resource and time. In that formula, a man stopped being a man.
He became a line in a calculation, a unit in a report, a figure that the factories across the ocean promised to replace with a new one. A machine can be built again. A crew can be trained anew. And as long as that conveyor turned faster than the enemy struck, the strategy counted as a success. At what cost? That no longer mattered in these calculations. And this was not the cruelty of individual commanders, but the arithmetic of total war itself. When the count runs into thousands of machines and tens of thousands of crews, a single fate dissolves into the general report. One bomber that did not return is a line. 100 is a statistic. And a statistic, unlike a man, can be recalculated, planned, and built into the budget before the mission even takes off. This applies to the coldest invention of that era, a war in which losses are budgeted in advance, the way you budget fuel consumption or tons of metal. That is why, behind the shine of the legend of survivability, you must always see the second figure too. Yes, the fortress was an incredibly strong machine. Yes, it dragged crews out of an inferno that seemed impossible to escape. But the war it was thrown into barely counted the survival of any single man at all. The machine was tough. The chance of one particular boy coming home was not. That is why this story is not only about the triumph of engineering, it is also about the coin in which that triumph was paid for. The toughness of the machine was measured in hits it could take, the cost of the strategy, in those who did not set back down on their own airfield. And these two quantities were almost never entered into the same table, because the total came out far too uncomfortable. And in that lies the very truth they long preferred to keep silent about. The heroism was real, the courage was real. But behind every frame of triumphant newsreel, behind every fortress that set down on a wing and a prayer, stood those 3 out of 4 who stayed in that sky for good. The legend of the unkillable machine was paid for by the thousands whom that war crossed off far more easily than it could ever cross off the machine. And now, having walked the whole road, from the first nickname to the last figure of losses, we can return to where it all began, to a simple question: what really made this machine a legend? And the answer now sounds firm, with no mysticism left in it. Not luck, not a miracle, not the mercy of the heavens, but a cold, exact calculation made up of 3 parts. The first, a machine built from the very first blueprint so that it was almost impossible to finish off. A strong body that spread the damage across the whole structure. A tail that held against everything. 4 independent engines, defense with no blind spots, tanks that sealed their own holes. Every detail worked toward one single goal: to come back. The second, a tactic that took that toughness and multiplied it by dozens. A formation that turned single machines into one bristling organism no one wanted to enter. What did not save you alone saved you together. This applies to the very nature of that war in the air. It was not lone heroes who survived there, but those who held the formation and covered the man beside them. And the third, the industry that made all of it possible on the scale of an entire war. A conveyor across the ocean, turning out fortresses by the thousand, replacing any loss faster than the enemy could inflict it. Without that third pillar, the first 2 would have hung in empty air. What good is a strong machine and a clever tactic if tomorrow you have nothing to replace your downed crews with? Take away any one of the 3, and there would have been no legend. A weak machine in a perfect formation would have fallen apart under fire. A strong machine with no formation would have been easy prey, and the strongest machine in the cleverest formation would still have lost the war if it could not be built without end.
This applies to the central lesson of this whole story. The fortress did not win by a single quality, but by a system in which every part held up the others. But it was not only steel that came together in this machine. Two forces collided in it that are hard to place side by side. On one hand, the living courage of the crews. Those very young men who climbed into a sky raked with fire, knowing their odds, and still flew the machine to the target, dragged it out of the flames, brought it down to the runway on a single engine. On the other, the cold, impersonal logic of an industrial power, for which both the machine and the man were, above all, a resource, a line in a calculation, a unit in a flow. And both of these truths are real, and neither can be thrown away.
You can admire the courage of those who flew these machines, and in the same second, shudder at the cold blood of those who counted their losses in rear offices. The fortress held both at once, the feat and the calculation. There lies its strange doubleness. It was at the same time a monument to human endurance and a tool of an impersonal war machine. This applies to why it is still remembered. A legend lives precisely where heroism and cruelty are twisted into one tight knot. The fortress became the symbol of a war of a new kind, a war whose outcome is decided not by the gleam of a single blade, but by the depth of the rear, the might of the factories, and the length of the conveyor. A war in which courage is still needed, but on its own no longer guarantees anything. Courage lifted these machines into the sky, and industry decided whether there would be enough of them to grind the enemy down. And yet even in that cold system, there remained room for the human. Recall that single mission, when an enemy ace lowered his weapon and escorted a wounded machine home. The system counted everything, the tons, the percentages, the losses. But it could not calculate the second in which one man suddenly refused to finish off the defenseless. Maybe that is exactly why, out of all the bookkeeping of that war, what stays in memory is not the reports, but moments like that, and the machines that outlived them. And in that lies the final hard truth of the fortress. It proved that in a war of engines, it is not enough to build the better machine. It is not even enough to devise the better tactic and gather the bravest men. All of that is only half the job. The other half is decided where no bullets whistle, in factory shops, in stocks of raw material, in a nation's ability to turn metal and labor into an endless flow of weapons. Slowly, heavily, inescapably, the fortress ground down the military strength of the Third Reich. Not with a single heroic surge, but with a methodical, endless flood. And in that lies its main lesson, one that reaches beyond a single aircraft. In a great war of engines, victory belongs not only to the side with the better technology, and not only to the side with the braver soldiers. It belongs to the side that can build without end, and without hesitation, throw what it has built back into battle, again and again. There is the whole secret of the unkillable fortress, not in the armor, not in the formation, but in the system that stood behind it, and that there was no way to stop. Not in that sky, and not in that whole war. And now, a word to you, to those who have stayed with us to this minute. If this story gripped you, if you looked in a new way at a machine about which it seemed everything had long been said, support the channel. It is simple, and to us it means a great deal. Hit the like button under this video. That way, far more viewers will learn about the fortress and about the men of that sky. Subscribe to the channel if you are not with us yet. There are still dozens of stories ahead about legendary machines, forgotten projects, and the closed pages of military aviation. And be sure to tap the bell, turn on notifications so you do not miss the next episode. it will be no less intense. And most important of all, write your opinion in the comments. What, in your view, held this machine in the sky? The metal, the formation, or the industrial might across the ocean? Argue, make your case, share it. We read every comment, and the strongest ones we will take apart separately. Thank you for being here to the end. Hold on tight, and see you in the next flight.